Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to our GIA Knowledge Sessions. These are a series of talks and seminars about gemology that are fueled by our decades of research. We consider ourselves so fortunate at GIA to study and learn from gemstones, and it's really our mission to share our discoveries and our learnings with the world. So I'm really excited to kick things off today. I'm Kelly Giordano, member of the content team here at GIA, and I'm joined by Wim Vertriest, GIA Manager of Field Gemology, and he'll be speaking today about how GIA connects sources, treatments, and science to identify rubies. So before we get started, there's just a bit of housekeeping. Everyone who is attending this is automatically on mute. So if you have a question, go ahead and use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen and feel free to ask questions as we go. There will be a Q&A session at the end where Wim will have the opportunity to answer some of your questions. We'll also be sending a recording of this session to everyone later today, and that message will include a survey, so we'd love to hear your feedback as well. And with that, I'm gonna pass you over to Wim.
Hi, thank you, Kelly, for the great introduction. I hope everyone can hear me. So welcome, everyone. I see there's people joining from all around the world. I see people from Nigeria, people from Belgium, people from the US, people from Hong Kong. So it's great to have so many people here. And I'm fortunate enough to tell the story about Ruby. The story about Ruby is a beautiful story. It's been told by many people already, but I thought it would be a good opportunity to tell it again. And to give some twists of it, of how GIA is involved with it and how GIA approaches the whole evolution of Ruby. So we're going to take a quick journey through space and time, basically, where we're going to look at different places of Ruby, where Ruby is found, where Ruby is mined, places that were historically relevant as well. And then maybe also see how treatments and politics maybe impacted those as well. So of course, if I want to tell that whole story, I could probably talk 45 days instead of 45 minutes about it. So obviously, we're going to skip some details. Some things we're going to go over fairly quick. So buckle up, because here we go. So the first thing we need to know is that Ruby is the stone that we chose because Ruby is considered the king of all colored gemstones. The king of all colored gemstones because Ruby, especially when it's untreated, commands the highest per carat price of all colored stones. It has been worn by kings and queens over the entire period of history, and it's always been wanted by nobility. And even nowadays, seeing a ruby really moves people and stirs a lot of emotions. I mentioned before, we're going to start with a journey through time. So we're going to start with the beginning, and we're going to look at the oldest sources of rubies first. So rubies in the old world, we can basically say it's Mohawk in Myanmar and the others. So for centuries, the world's ruby supply has been dominated by rubies from the legendary Mohawk Valley, which is in current day Myanmar, but has been called Burma, and a whole lot of different names over the history. Of course, two other places I want to highlight are Jagdalek, Afghanistan, which has produced some rubies, and of course, Sri Lanka. So let's start with just a little bit about Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka as a gem source is, of course, mostly known for its sapphires. Sri Lanka is sapphire land. But as we know, sapphire and ruby are the same gem mineral. So where you find sapphires, chances of finding rubies are possible. So the difference is in the coloring agents. So of course, when you find a lot of sapphires, especially in Sri Lanka, where you also find a lot of pink sapphires, if you find a really intense pink sapphire or a really dark pink sapphire, that is called a red sapphire, but that is technically a ruby. So you do find some rubies there, but they're rather rare, and they're always in second place or third place or fourth place in a place that is rightfully called blue sapphire land. So these are two images of Sri Lanka, one where we see the traditional mining that is still being done today, where people are mining in a paddy field, which means that it is rice that is standing underwater. So people are mining under the water table and bringing gravels with the gems back up to the surface. And you see it's a beautiful, pristine area, lots of nice rugged mountains in the area around Ratnapura. And then when the gravels are brought up, people are washing them in streams or in just ponds where the water is gathered, just to clear off the mud. And they do that with these baskets, and these baskets have been documented for centuries almost. If you look at early footage, the earliest footage of Sri Lankan gem mining, you see people using the exact same techniques that you still see today. So the other source that I mentioned for the Old World are the rubies in the Old World from Jagdalek, Afghanistan. So Jagdalek, Afghanistan produces some very nice colored rubies, but it's all from a hard rock deposit. So it's very hard mining, but it's estimated, and some people say that mining has been going on for over 800 years in Jagdalek, Afghanistan. It is even rumored that the courts of Kublai Khan, who is the grandson of Genghis Khan, that he possessed some of the Afghani rubies back at the time. Of course, the Afghan rubies never really took a big place in the market, and it is mainly because of the clarity. Usually the clarity of the Afghan rubies is fairly low. So while their color is extremely attractive, like we can see on the Gems and Gemology cover from summer 1998, where we can see this beautiful crystal that is about 2 centimeters long, incredible color. This one is from Jagdalek, Afghanistan. Unfortunately, the gem below it, which is a beautiful 2-carat stone, is not from Jagdalek, Afghanistan. That is a stone from Mohawk, Myanmar. And Mohawk, Myanmar is the source that I want to discuss next. This is a picture that I took when you come into Mohawk. The first thing you're greeted with is a big sign that says, "Welcome to Ruby Land." And I think that just says it all. Mohawk is Ruby Land. It is the one place on the earth where everybody breathes, eats, mines, thinks, lives rubies. Everything is about rubies in Mohawk. And that's why it's called Ruby Land. It's a beautiful village with surrounded hills, and all those hills are full of gemstone mines, primarily focused on ruby, but also a lot of other gemstones. I think Mohawk produces everything basically from alexandrite to zircon and in between. But rubies is what people are looking for. So this is a picture that I took next to the lake in central Mohawk. And this lake is actually a remnant of an old ruby mine. So when the British mining company started mining here, they dug a very big hole and they just naturally let it fill in the middle of the town, and it became this lake. And in recent years, they've added a walkway around it and really cleaned up the area. So it's a beautiful area to take a walk in the evening if you ever get the chance to go to Mohawk. Plus you have amazing sceneries. The whole landscape and the temples are all reflected in the lake. So a beautiful area. So as I said, all these hills you see in the background, those are full of ruby mines. And those ruby mines look like this. Miners are digging tunnels hundreds of meters deep in search of those rubies. It's extremely hard work. People use explosives. They dig out all the gravel, but it is all worth it because of the value of those rubies, that people can dig tunnels sometimes 800 meters deep and extract rubies from those places. Now, of course, not all rubies come out of these hard rock mines in marble. Some of these rubies are also found in secondary deposits. Secondary deposits means that those rubies are already removed from the hard host rock. So they've been concentrated by water action, and they are now found in what we call alluvial deposits, deposits full of gravel, where they're already concentrated. So they're a bit easier to mine. And here we see a few guys with these high pressure water jets, just loosening up the soil here on the side. And that soil with all the water and the mud is flowing down. And there's these guys here picking out the big boulders that are definitely not rubies. And all of that is going to a wash plant where then the denser material like ruby and other gemstones is separated from the mud and the low value materials like quartzes and feldspars, for example. Now Mohawk, because it is such an old mining town, it is such an old mining area, and they've been mining there, I think, it's 2 years ago that they celebrated the documented mining that has been, so mining that has been documented 800 years ago, they celebrated that anniversary. So 800 years ago, somebody already wrote down that they were mining there, which means that it's probably been going on for a lot longer. Of course, when it's that integrated within the community fabric, local customs start to develop. And one of those customs is what they call the Kanase custom. So Kanase miners are allowed to work the tailings of a big mine. So big mine companies, they have licenses But everything they discard is viewed as property of all the people in the village. So everybody can start mining it and can start picking out the small gems. And that is exactly what this gentleman here is doing. So the fence we see in the background is actually the edge of a mining license, and behind it is their wash plant. So all this muddy water that you see coming from under the fence right here, that has been through the wash plant. And very often those wash plants, they sieve off below a certain size. So everything below, let's say 3 millimeters, is just washed away and ends up right here at this guy's feet. So that's what he's looking for. And these are the gems that he found during that day. So he proudly showed us a couple of spinels mainly, and a few zircons and a garnet. But of course, like I mentioned before, this is what it's all about. Finding rubies. Rubies are really the king in Mohawk. This guy was walking through his mine, he's a mine owner in Myanmar, and he was moving his hand through the wash plant just to feel the water move and to feel if there's any gem. And all of a sudden he pulls out this amazing, I'm gonna say it's at least a 2-gram ruby crystal that he pulled out right in front of our eyes. And you can see that he was extremely happy with that stone, as were we, to be able to witness that stone coming out of the ground right in front of our eyes. So of course, when you fasten them, this is what it's all about. These rubies with that unique glow, that unique color, that is what made Burma, what made Mohawk famous. Incredible stones with the most amazing fluorescence were found there. And that has been making its way to courts and royalty all around the world for hundreds of years. I also want to make a side note that this kind of ruby is not the only ruby that is being found in Mohawk, Burma. You also find some amazing star rubies, rubies showing asterism when they're fastened with cabochons. So Mohawk is also a prime location for star rubies, which are also highly coveted and even rarer than good quality rubies. Now, of course, we can't talk about rubies in the old world without talking about the rubies from the old world. Why do I say, quote open, rubies, quote closed? Because many important rubies from these treasuries that we know, not rubies at all. A lot of the historic important pieces actually turned out to be red spinel mined in Badakhshan, Central Asia. Badakhshan with a very convenient position on the Silk Roads, which was the main trade route between Asia and Europe before the sea routes were discovered. A lot of those gemstones made their way to Europe from Badakhshan, Central Asia, and have now ended up in some of the most famous jewels and historic artifacts in the world. This was highlighted, I think, earlier this week in one of the Knowledge Rocks emails from GIA, where they call it the Master of Disguise and bring up the British Imperial State Crown, which features a really big red gem in the center. And it is called the Black Prince Ruby, but that is not a ruby at all. It is a spinel. And another famous of those rubies is the Timur Ruby, which is a massive ruby that was actually part of the same treasury that the Koh-i-Noor diamond was part of. And that also made its way into the British royalty. Now, of course, in later years, like in the last 2 centuries, we've seen some glimpses of new deposits come in as well. I still consider those old worlds, although they can really trace their history back hundreds or sometimes even thousands of years. But one of those places I want to highlight is Longido in Tanzania. Longido in Tanzania was basically the first ruby discovery on mainland Africa. And ruby was discovered near the foothills of Longido. It was discovered in 1914, and according to the stories and legend, it was very closely related to a World War I campaign in East Africa. Because before World War I, Tanzania was German East Africa, and it later became part of British East Africa. The story goes that it's a soldier who was a little bit distracted about all the gunfights, that he looked down and saw some amazing red stones and so discovered the first ruby deposit in Africa. It's a hard rock deposit, which means that there's no secondary deposits. It's really hard to work there. You really need blasting, tunneling, going very deep. And it was mined with various degrees of success during the last 100 years. But the material they produced there is so typical, so unique, I'm 100% sure that everyone has seen this. So this is the material that is mined there. It's these bright red ruby crystals that you find within a really nice green matrix. The matrix is zoisite, and of course the red crystals are ruby, which cause people to call this ruby and zoisite, which you see a lot, and it's a lot of times used for amazing carvings, like this mouse carving, where the mouse is entirely carved out of the ruby, and the leaf that it's sitting on is entirely carved out of the zoisite. But this is one piece. This was originally one rock, and that whole rock combination of ruby plus that green zoisite and black amphibolite, black amphibole, is called aniolite. And that name actually comes from the Maasai word for green, anioli. The Maasai are the traditional inhabitants of that area and are still the main traders of this material nowadays. Of course, other deposits were found as well. I mean, people for centuries have described the gem riches of the kingdoms of Siam. Early explorers mentioned it already. People like Marco Polo, people that followed in his footsteps, already mentioned the gem riches of the kingdom of Siam. And already in the late 1800s, we can find documented evidence that foreign companies were allowed to work ruby and sapphire deposits in East Thailand with various degrees of success. So those stones were coming in the market, and the fact that they were being worked by foreign companies means that a lot of these rubies came to the consuming market at that day, which was mainly in Europe. So a lot of these stones showed up in Europe. That's what these stones look like, Thai rubies, amazing stones. You can see they're fairly big, 5 carat plus. This one's almost 7 carat, but you see that the color is a bit different from the Burmese stones. They're not as fluorescent, but they are extremely clean, a nice crisp color, beautiful stones really. Now, of course, imagine if you're running a gem lab in those days. Imagine 60 years ago, 70 years ago, someone comes up to me, hi, I have this ruby and I want to do origin determination on it. And now I'm going to blatantly steal a slide from my colleague, Dr. Aaron Palke, who gave a talk 2 weeks ago on origin determination of field gemology, where he said that if you wanted to do ruby origin 100 years ago, you mainly faced Mohawk rubies and Thai rubies. And the distinction between them could be fairly easily made with the state-of-the-art technology of that time, which was the microscope. Now, Dr. Aaron Palke says that. I fully support him in that, but there's someone else who said that as well. So I found this article in Gems and Gemology, spring 1940. So this article is almost, almost 80 years old, by one Dr. Edward Gubelin. And he starts his article with the sentence that it is generally known that most rubies in the trade come from Burma and Siam. So most of the rubies in 1940 were coming from Mohawk and from Thailand. Unfortunately, I had not enough material from Ceylon at hand. Ceylon is an old name for Sri Lanka. So he says there's rubies coming out of Sri Lanka as well, but they're very rare and I don't have enough material to study them. So to make the distinction between them, he notices things like the difference of color, something that I brought up before when I showed you the Thai ruby and the Burmese ruby. The difference of these coloring matter is also clearly manifest by luminescence under UV rays. Basically, the fluorescence of these stones is very different. The dichroism is also a little different, where the Thai rubies very often have a little bit more of a brown tone or are a little bit darker, while the Burmese rubies are very nicely expressed, typical ruby dichroism. But the most important thing that Dr. Gubelin said in that article is the microscopic analysis is the surest, easiest, and most advantageous way to arrive at conclusions about origin determination. So that's in 1940, where a microscope is able to separate the two main deposits at that time. I'm just going to grab this opportunity to do a shout out to Gems and Gemology. Every Gems and Gemology issue is available online for free, going from the first issue all the way from 1934 to the last issue that was published a few months ago. And just if you have some time, go look at some of these older issues, because you see some amazing stories in there, pieces that became history, things that really lead you down a track that you can keep searching and searching and searching upon. So I took a look in depth at this first issue this morning, and I just want to highlight a few anecdotes on it. Like there's stories in there about people that returned from the Orient, so Asia, with rubies, and they bought these extremely expensive gemstones as Burmese rubies for $80 a carat, but they turned out to be synthetic rubies. And for the same goes as well in the reverse direction, where people bought synthetic rubies, but they turned out to be natural rubies. So people were facing those problems in 1934 already. And then my favorite story of this issue is a story about how GIA loaned a series of famous diamond replicas, including the Orlov diamond, to MGM Motion Picture Studios. Those are the guys with the big lion when they opened the movie for a new Hollywood production. So somewhere in the 1930s, there's a movie being made in Hollywood with diamond replicas from GIA's collection. I think that's just incredible. And if anyone knows that movie, please let me know because I'd love to check it out. Now, of course, the ruby story doesn't stop with that. The ruby development continued in the last decades where the world has changed at an incredible pace, and the ruby trade was no exception there. So I just want to show this map to put a few places in perspective. So on the western side here, we have Mohawk in Burma. If we go a little to the southeast, we have Thailand. Thailand borders to Burma with these land borders in the very remote mountains in the northern part of Thailand. But the capital of Thailand, Bangkok, is right here. And then Chantaburi, which is a town that should ring a bell for almost everyone who's familiar with ruby and sapphire, is here on the eastern side of Thailand. And then, of course, I want to bring in position Vietnam as well, which is very close to Thailand and just separated by Laos and Cambodia, because that's important for some parts of the story as well. So if we look at post-World War II rubies and really look at how politics can affect the market, you have to know that in 1962, there was a coup d'etat in Myanmar where Burma went under military rule. Burma went under military rule and closed itself off from the rest of the world, quite literally. Nothing went in and out anymore. And in the following years, most of the mines were nationalized. Most of the gem mines were nationalized. So a lot of the gem resources from Myanmar, including rubies, were nationalized with various degrees of success. Now, of course, what that means is the gem supply of Burmese stones goes basically dry and becomes limited to smuggling. So Burma, which has really been at the top of the producing back then, really lost its position because those stones couldn't go out of the country anymore, couldn't get into the international market. Now, a few years later, there's this other major event in Southeast Asia. It's called the Second Indochina War, sometimes referred to as the Vietnam War, or as they call it in Vietnam, the American War, which is a conflict that really peaked in the 1960s. In that period, Thailand is a main ally of the US. And it is estimated that, depending on sources, 1.7 to 2.5 billion US dollars were pumped into the Thai economy in form of investment and aid. Thailand was used by the US as a platform for a lot of its airstrikes. So a lot of aircraft and aircraft personnel was based in Thailand. And of course, because all these high-tech equipment was there, they required a lot of supporting industries. A lot of Thai industries were developed by the US to support that military, but also to support the soldiers as well. It's estimated that at least 50,000 US military personnel was active on Thai soil at one point. And a lot of these guys were spending their leave in Thailand. Spending their leave, which means that they really build a foundation for a lot of the industries that Thailand is famous for. A lot of the tourism was developed because of those guys. A lot of the foundations were laid there. So the combination of a lot of that infrastructure being built, plus a lot of that high-tech equipment becoming available within Thailand, really benefited Thailand a lot in all aspects. Agriculture, road construction, building construction, the early computers, but also the gem industries benefited a lot. Because if you have access to all of these high-tech equipments, which means that you can just pick up the yellow pages and call a supplier of chemical products, and you can get chemical products like additives for treatment right away. You can just get high-tech ceramics that are resistant to very high heat, which allow you to experiment with heat treatment at higher temperatures by just picking up the phone and calling them. that is not something that was possible in a lot of places. So the availability of a lot of these high-tech equipment really allowed Thailand to develop its treatment industry of gemstones. But that is another story that we can maybe focus on another time. This also allowed Thailand to really expand its gem industries, its gem mining industry. So we know that Burma basically closed itself off, so that supply of Burmese rubies was dropping, but at the same time, Thailand really put itself on the forefront, and the Thai rubies became more important, and massive mining operations were built there. Like, these are photos from the Dr. Gubelin slide collection that are at the GIA library. These are pictures from the late 80s, where you can see that there's massive operations going on with many dump trucks, lots of excavators, huge washing plants to really get the rubies out and bring them into the market, because there was a demand for those rubies and Thailand was able to supply it. Now, of course, these songs don't last forever. And in the early 1990s, Myanmar started to open up its economy a little bit. Of course, it wasn't a free-for-all, but some more stones were starting to trickle out of the country. And a lot of that had to do with the discovery of Mongshu. The Mongshu ruby mines were discovered in the early 90s, about the same time that Myanmar was opening up. So a lot of these stones came to the international market, mainly through smuggling them across the Thai-Burmese border at a few of the border crossings, mainly Mae Sot, Mae Sai, where a lot of these stones came from the Burmese mines, crossed the border, and then were then sold at markets like the one we can see here on the picture, to Thai traders, international traders, who took the stones to Bangkok, to Chantaburi, to get them treated, and then they entered the international markets. So here you can see two pictures taken by Robert Kamerlingh in the late 80s when he visited some of these markets. So you can just see that there's people sitting there with these enormous parcels of high quality rubies, really clipping them just right there in the street and inspecting them. So you can just imagine how many high quality rubies were coming into the market there. So of course, for Mongshu ruby, this is an incredible example. It's huge, it's clean. The cut isn't 100% perfect, but it is still an incredible gem, 6.21 carat from Mongshu. But you can see here that it is heat treated, as are most stones from this locality. These stones do not come out of the ground like this. They often require a lot of help to reach their full potential. And the two main issues where they require some help are these. First of all, a lot of the Mongshu rubies have a really dark blue core, like inky blue. And this can be dissolved by heat treating them at fairly low temperatures. So by heat treating them, you can reduce the impact of this dark core and really give them a nicer overall appearance. Another issue with Mongshu ruby are the abundance of fractures. A lot of this material is very fractured. Treatments that you can apply to these stones to heal those fractures. That is what we call heating with additives like borax, which acts as a flux. That technique has been applied before, but I think it really became common, and the recipe basically was really perfected on the Mongshu rubies. So how that process really works, I'm just gonna go through this schematic real quick, is that in picture A, you have the stone before heat treatment. So the ruby has a fracture like the Mongshu ruby, which is really full of those fractures. And you apply basically a flux to it. What is a flux? A flux is something that when you bring it in contact with another material, it lowers the melting temperature. So when you put flux in that fracture and you bring it to high temperature, your ruby will start to melt at temperatures that are substantially lower than the actual melting point of corundum, which is really high. So locally, you start really turning your corundum into a liquid, started really melting it. And then when you cool it down, that really crystallizes again, and it crystallizes in that fracture. So you're crystallizing corundum in that fracture, really healing the fracture with more corundum. That is what they're doing with it. It has been done with other stones as well, but the recipe was really perfected on Mongshu ruby. And a lot of the Mongshu rubies you see out there nowadays really have a lot of evidence of being flux healed with rubies. Now, of course, I can hear everyone think to their computer, is that it? Are those the only ruby sources that really matter? Then you go from Mohawk to Thailand, back to Myanmar in my shoe. Of course not. There are other deposits that shows up. So when we're thinking about other deposits, I'm going to start with what is geographically closest to those places. So looking nearby, ruby was found in the late 80s in the Luc Yen area in northern Vietnam. So it was found, I believe, in 1988. But in the early 90s, large operations were set up there, usually in partnership with experienced Thai miners and the Vietnamese government. But unfortunately, the area is so remote, it's so mountainous, it's really surrounded by a lot of hills, mountains, very steep, that the potential for large-scale mining is actually very low. So by the mid-1990s, most of those large-scale mines quit their operations because they were no longer sustainable. However, that didn't mean that ruby mining stopped. Nowadays, you can still see a lot of small operations that target the more difficult deposits that weren't hit by those big guys, those big mines 25 years ago. So I mentioned, like in the valleys, a lot of the gemstones are gone. But if you go up in the hills, in the little narrow valleys, where it is very easy to mine with a few guys and a very simple setup, you can still get a lot of rubies. But those big valley-wide deposits, you can't really mine them. And to show the difference, I have two pictures here. Like the one on the left is a picture from 1992 taken by Robert Kamerlingh when he visited those areas. And you can obviously see this is a very well organized, very large impact mining with high equipment. The one on the right is a picture that I took in 2015, where you can just see a couple of ladies that are in a mountain stream, really in a narrow valley, looking to some gravels, manually looking for some rubies there. So there's still rubies being mined, but not really on a scale like it was 25 years ago. Now, these are the rubies that people are looking for. We have Vietnamese rubies that actually remind us a lot of the typical Mohawk ruby, incredible color, often a bit on the smaller side, but incredible colors, really deep, nice red with very strong fluorescence. And the Vietnamese ruby deposits also produce really fine star rubies, again, very similar to Mohawk in Myanmar. If we look at other frontiers, the world is opening up in the last decades. And of course, in Africa, which is a main front for exploration, several ruby discoveries were made. And I'm just going to highlight a few of them. Like the one that is here in the middle, the one that I didn't label, that is actually the Longido deposit that I discussed briefly before. And the three other deposits I want to highlight right now are Mangari in Kenya, Morogoro in Tanzania, and Windsor in Tanzania. So if we look at Mangari, Kenya, this is the mining pit. So you can see it's in the middle of the savannah, beautiful stretched out landscape, but it's actually a pretty big mine where people are mining a hard rock deposit. Because you can see this guy standing here in the middle, but in the back here, you can see some really heavy equipment. This is a full-scale excavator. So that gives you an idea of the size of this pit where people were mining. And you can see here that the name of the mine is John Stoll. John Stoll is actually the guy who discovered this mine. So John Stoll was a geologist, an explorer in East Africa, and is very involved with a lot of ruby and other gemstone discoveries. And he discovered this gemstone deposit of rubies in Mangari, Kenya, and operated the mine for a short period before he had to give the mine up. But that is still called the John Stoll mine to this. I think the name now changed, but it is still known commonly as the John Stoll mine. The rubies that were found there look like this. So you can see really nice, attractive color, like really pink to deep red. No modifying hues, there's no brown tone, no orange tone. But you can see that clarity might be considered an issue. So a lot of these stones are translucent to semi-transparent. So faceted goods from the John Stoll mine are actually extremely rare. Most of what comes out are actually cabochons and fine cabochons, fine beads of the most incredible color. A color that is still described to this day by connoisseurs as John Stoll color. So amazing ruby deposit, unfortunately not that many faceted gems that came out. One of the other ruby sources in East Africa that was discovered was Morogoro in Tanzania. Now, the Morogoro province actually hosts two deposits, one in the Uluguru Mountains in the northeast and one near Mahenge in the southwest. The one in Mahenge is not one I'm going to focus on right now. Mahenge is mainly known as a spinel deposit, but also produces some really nice rubies. So you can see the Uluguru Mountains in the background of this photo. Really beautiful area, very pristine, very green. And people are mining there for rubies, but also for some other gemstones. So these are some of the stones that were found there. On the left, you can see some very recent production of some of the rubies that were found there. So you can see that the clarity is not great, but color-wise, they're really spectacular. You can see this star ruby actually came from Morogoro as well. This is an older stone. I haven't seen or haven't heard from a lot of production of this quality recently, but still, those stones are still out there. Those stones are still being traded. They don't go bad. They're still in the vaults. They're still in jewelry right now. And then the last Tanzania source I want to discuss is Windsor, Tanzania. In 2007, Windsor, Tanzania was discovered, and the ruby deposit there triggered a big rush. So Windsor produced some outstanding rubies and other gem corundums, but only for a very short period of time. It is estimated that around 6 months that it peaked, and after that, it completely faded away. But in that period, it produced some really fine gems. Fine gems, like really fine rubies that are untreated. But Windsor is also known for its bicolor, tricolor gems. Windsor is one of the few deposits in the world that produce gem quality material that combine blue sapphire and red ruby in one stone. And these are still highly desired and highly recognizable by connoisseurs as typical for Windsor, Tanzania. Now, of course, if we jump across the sea a little bit, we stay in East Africa. There's a beautiful place there that's called Madagascar. Madagascar has been nicknamed the Beryl Island by Alfred Lacroix, who wrote an essay that is labeled Un voyage au pays des beryls. So a journey to the land of the beryls, where he described a lot of the gemstones, which were mainly beryls at the time, coming out of Madagascar. Of course, right now, we know Madagascar mainly for a different gemstone. So in the mid-90s, the Beryl Island really turned into sapphire land. The discovery of Ilakaka in the mid-1990s, which is mainly known for blue sapphires, fancy sapphires, but produces everything basically from alexandrite to zircon and all the things in between. The deposit in Andronandambo, which was discovered also in the mid-1990s, produced some outstanding blue sapphires, reminiscent of the typical Kashmir material. Then the deposit in the north, this one here, nicknamed Diego Suarez, was discovered around or really became popular around the same time, and produces a lot of dark blue, but also green and yellow sapphire. So this is more commercial grade, but a lot of volume, and it is still an important supplier for the trade nowadays. But the one I really want to focus on is this one right here, in the northeastern part of Madagascar, where some fine sapphire discoveries were made, called Andre Babe Didi in 2012, which also produced some rubies. And then most recently, the Bementi sapphire deposit in 2017 that produced some outstanding sapphires, both blues and paparacha colors, for only a short period, but really beautiful stones, high volume, and really caused a shockwave in the sapphire market. But it is that same area where those fine sapphires came from that also hosts rubies. In that same area in the northeast are numerous deposits of rubies that have always been typically worked in rushes. So people discover something and it attracts a lot of attention, and people gather there in the thousands, sometimes 10,000 miners to start mining material. So just to name a few of those, the Vatumandri deposit is one of the earliest rushes there. Then the Andilamena was probably one of the biggest, where it's estimated that 20,000 people gathered in the middle of the jungle. And this is not too far from Didi, which produced both ruby and blue sapphire. And this is actually a really fine, rough ruby seen during a GIA expedition to Didi and photographed by Vincent Pagdier, who had the privilege to go there and witness that rush while it was happening. And then the most recent ruby rush is in Zahamena, actually taking place in a national park in 2015, again bringing a flock of those really fine, high quality rubies from Madagascar to the market. Now, of course, the stone I'm showing here is a unique example. This is really the 1%er. This is an extremely privileged stone that combines size, clarity, and amazing color. The majority of the stones that come out of the ground are more looking like this. Those rough rubies, yes, rubies, they can benefit a lot from a procedure that we call glass filling. So glass filling is a treatment that is often applied to low-grade material, low-grade rubies. The glass filling procedures have been developed since the 1980s, but really became popular and really been produced in massive quantities when that material from Madagascar started coming, because it was very suitable for it. So when you glass fill the material shown in this photo, it turns into this material. So this is exactly the same batch of rough that looks incredibly improved. The color becomes more apparent, the clarity is improved. So when you cut this, these are all glass-filled rubies. So you see that there's a huge range of impact that this can have on a stone. Of course, this treatment is very important to disclose because it is not always stable under every condition. But there are some excellent seminars being given in the last weeks that fully go in detail on the procedure of glass filling of rubies and how to identify it. Fortunately for basically every gemologist, this treatment is one of the easiest treatments to detect if you know what you're looking for. Now, of course, we cannot talk about mentioning Mozambique. So in 2008, 2009, in northern Mozambique, there were different areas that started producing rubies. The first one was in the Nyassa area, where there's these two areas that started producing rubies. The Nyassa area, extremely remote, extremely far, also a protected area. So not really a lot of potential for large-scale mining or development of a gemstone community there. But some of the stones that came out there, these are three examples of in the 2 to 2 range of heat-treated rubies that were reportedly coming from Nyassa. So you can see extremely fine rubies. This was really the first material that came out of Mozambique. But quickly that whole trade shifted from Nyassa to another place called Montepuez, where rubies were discovered next to a highway in unprotected areas. So there's potential for large-scale mining there. And the stones that were found there are truly incredible. So you can see the one on the left is one of the earlier production, an amazing stone. The one on the right is one of the later production from another deposit that produced a different type of ruby. But it's clear that the area around Montepuez has an incredible potential, produces huge volumes, huge quantities of very nice quality material. A lot of the material that isn't coming out as beautiful as it is can be enhanced. So there's a lot of room for improvement for those stones as well. So there's material there that can be used for glass filling, for regular heat treatment, and is untreated. So it really covers basically every market segment. Now, of course, I mentioned treatment of these stones, and then a significant part of high value Mozambican rubies can be enhanced by low temperature heat treatment. Low temperature heat treatment is nothing new. Mozambican rubies were not the stones that this was invented on. It is inspired by century old techniques that were employed in Sri Lanka on their sapphires there. Why did the Sri Lankans do this on their sapphires? It is when their sapphire was too dark blue, they could reduce the blue. When it was a pink stone with some blue zoning, they could remove that blue zoning. When it was a very pale pink or like a blotchy, a very pale blue, or like a blotchy blue stone, they could remove that blue and turn it into colorless sapphire, which they could use as a diamond simulant. That's exact same principle was applied here. Like you can see the stone, the image on the left, in the top, there's this darker zone. There's this blue band in the ruby that will create an additional darkness. So the Sri Lankan technique of this low temperature treatment allows you to remove, to reduce that darker blue zone and really almost make it invisible, like this stone on the right. This is a stone from an experiment that we did in the lab in GIA in Bangkok, where we heat treated this stone at 800 degrees Celsius, which is not extremely high for rubies, for only 160 minutes. So a very short period as well. And it has such a huge effect already. because it is done at such low temperatures, it makes it very challenging to detect. A lot of these rubies are already very clean, so there's not a lot of things to go on. So you often need to rely on advanced technology, and even then, the results are not always very clear. So the last ruby deposit I want to discuss and really introduce to you is Greenland Ruby. Greenland Ruby, the title I use here is the newest mine at the oldest deposit. Why do I do that? Because the Greenland Ruby mine only started coming in operation a few years ago. Production is only now hitting the market. Why do I say the oldest deposit? These rubies are hosted in one of the oldest rocks on Earth. The host rocks of these rubies are more than 3 billion years old. That's just incredible. So on the right, we can see a picture that was taken during a GIA expedition to this mine and to this deposit, where you can see that it's highly mechanized, very heavy equipment. And that red building that you can see here in the background is a state-of-the-art sort house, where a lot of the material that is being fed into that sort house automatically gets processed, rubies get detected, gets automatically separated from the waste material. So very high-tech, very modern operation. Now this is an example of some of the rubies. This is on the top left, you can see some of the rough that came out of the ground. The matrix, the hard rock material, because they're all mining this from a hard rock deposit. You can see on that handpiece on the far right. Those that have paid attention to GIA's Knowledge Rocks emails in the last weeks maybe recognize this piece, because this is the piece that I'm holding like this, and it is right now in GIA's collection for study. And these are some examples of rubies that came through the GIA lab. So these are very big. They're 6 to 27 carats, but you can see that the clarity is not super high. A lot of these stones benefit from cutting them as cabochons with an incredible color, really sweet red color, but they're not really prone to being facet grade, being clean enough to facet. But outstanding cabochons, sugar loaves, beads are being cut from this material right now. So to just give you a short overview, what does this have for an impact on the lab? I brought up the impact for the lab if you did it 70, 80 years ago, when you basically had Mohawk and Siam, which were very easy to separate. And this whole topic has been discussed by Aaron Tolke in his talk 2 weeks ago. But just to summarize you, that you go from 2 deposits, being Mohawk and Siam. Those two deposits are still out there. Those stones are still out there. But in addition to that, you have to add all the deposits from East Africa, which means Kenya rubies, Tanzania rubies, numerous deposits in Tanzania. You have the Mozambican rubies, which are really found everywhere in the market in all kinds of price ranges. Madagascar material, but also other lesser known sources like Malawi, some more obscure deposits in Kenya. They're all out there. And then I'm only talking East Africa. Asia also started producing a lot of rubies as well. The Vietnamese deposit, the Maishu deposit, especially Maishu, that produced a lot of volumes in the 90s and the early 2000s, is very common in the market. And then there's other deposits in other parts of the world. Greenland is one of the main examples, but who knows what we'll find in the coming years. That just makes it an additional challenge for the labs to keep up with where all these rubies come from, but it also provides a variety of rubies for the consumer, rubies that can fit basically every budget and every taste. Now on treatment detections, I think it's safe to say that 80 years ago, nobody really cared about treatments. Caring about treatments is something that happened in the last 40, 50 years maybe. And since then, a lot of new treatments have shown up. Like I mentioned, that flux healing that really became very dominant when that Maishu material came out. Luckily for us, it is pretty straightforward to detect that. And the glass filling that became a standard practice and really global with the Madagascar material, that is fortunately for us one of the easiest treatments to detect. And then there's the low temperature treatments that is being done on rubies now, a treatment that has been done for centuries on sapphire varieties, but now reacts really well with that Mozambican ruby, which is actually quite challenging to detect in some cases. So that is apart from the lab. I just want to give some background on all of this information as well. And that what GIA field gemology does is that GIA also documents the global gem trade. Field gemology is not only going to the places and collecting stones it's also collecting information. And especially when that information comes closer to the source, because that is where there's a lot of questions. There's a lot of unknowns. People are very familiar with everything that happens with your stone once it ends up with your jeweler. Like the jewelry making process is very well documented, but the trading process, the treating process, and even the cutting process of a lot of the colored gemstones we work with is still shrouded in a lot of mystery. So with field gemology, we try to bring a lot of that to the end consumer, to gemologists, to people, to basically everybody who wants to know more about it. So we've been doing that since the start of GI's field gemology department. But in the last two and a half years, we've really augmented that effort, really stepped up our game, and really reached out to a lot of key players and pioneers in Ruby and Sapphire, both mining, trading, and treating. Because as I mentioned, a lot of these very exciting developments happened in the last 40 years. So the people who pioneered all these techniques, all these treatments, and who really saw that growth firsthand, they're all still with us, but they're all phasing out of the business. So now is an opportune time to talk to them, to interview them, to collect video interviews. And some people like here, Simon Simon Bruce Lockhart, who's a trader in Chantaburi, and one of his business partners, Johnny Conde, who is an African, but who's lived in Thailand for more than 20 years and supplies a lot of rough for that trade. They've been helping us to get in contact and learn a lot about these people and how this whole network of new sources, new treatments, market responses, how that is all connected. Now, of course, if you want to know more about this Ruby story has been told by a lot of people. I did not make this up. This is distilled all by myself. This is compiled from different sources. And a lot of people have told that story in very unique ways, sometimes with a different angle. Like there's a very good article that you can access for free in Gems and Gemology from the winter edition from 2009 by Russell Shore and Robert Weldon from GIA, where they really focused on the last 25 years of Ruby and Sapphire production. So that is actually from everything that happened from 35 years ago to 10 years ago. So you don't have to go look there for Mozambique and rubies, but they really address the market impact of my shoe. So this is really focused on what how the market responded to it. Another really fine article that tells the same story is by Vincent Pardieu in Color, which was I think about exactly 1 year ago, in the In Color edition, spring 2019, which you can find through the ICA website, where he looked at the ruby trade with a particular focus on the position of Thailand and Thai traders and traders in there. And then, of course, as a last source that I want to give you, this one is not available for free, but it is worth every penny you could spend on it, is the book that has everything you ever could know about Ruby and Sapphire. Ruby and Sapphire, a Gemologist's Guide by Richard Hughes and his family. It has a couple of chapters, but the last chapter actually comprises more than half of the book, and it talks about every source where Ruby and Sapphire has been found or has been described. Some of these descriptions are only a few lines long. For other sources, he has dozens of pages with information, background, geology, trade knowledge, history. I think the section on Myanmar is over 50 pages long. So if you really want to know more about this Ruby story and more about these sources, this is an excellent resource to go for. So I hope everyone enjoyed this a little bit. I know this was a roller coaster. We went really fast, jumped from one place to another. Due to the time constraints, I could only give like a very short introduction. As I said in the beginning, I could probably talk like this for another 2 or 3 days. But unfortunately, it's almost 1 at night here in Bangkok, and I have to go to bed. But I'll stay on for a little bit longer for some questions. Thank you very much for staying.
Thank you, Wim, and thank you everyone for staying. We did get a lot of really great questions, so I'm gonna try and get through as many as we can before, you know, Wim is ready to go to bed, even though I'm sure he already is. Okay, so how does one distinguish a natural ruby and a lab-created ruby with the naked eye, or do you have to do it under a microscope?
The naked eye is very tricky. I mean, those lab-created rubies are challenging. I would always rely on a microscope to identify them because a lot of the growth textures that you're looking for are just not visible with the naked eye, not even with the 10x loop most of the times. So yeah, I would always rely on the microscope to make a decisive call for that.
Okay. Is there an exact color definition for ruby?
Well, ruby is red. So that is the color definition. That brings us to the follow-up question. Is there a definition for red? No, there isn't. This is never going to get solved. This is always going to be a discussion that we're going to have. It makes it, some people find it annoying. Other people find it the beauty in gemology. But I think this is a never-ending story, is where does pink stop and red begin?
Do we have any idea what % of the world's rubies have been heat treated?
God, that's very difficult to say. I think the closest I can get to a number is saying the vast majority.
Okay. So with a flux treated ruby that repairs a fracture, do you see the leftover flux under the magnification? And is there any risk of somebody identifying that as a synthetic ruby?
So yeah, that is, when you look at flux healed rubies, those patterns that you see in there, actually the scars of those healed fractures, those are extremely similar to flux grown synthetic rubies. Now, of course, in flux grown synthetic rubies, you also have other characteristics, like you have those metallic platelets that are from the crucible where it was grown in, while in the flux grown rubies, flux healed rubies, you often have a lot of natural inclusions as well. And very often those fractures are extremely abundant in those natural stones as well. But it can be extremely tricky, and they're probably the closest thing to each other. So that's why I say it is pretty straightforward to identify those, because the one thing that you can really mix it up with is with those flux grown synthetic rubies.
Okay. Is it correct to assume that GIA has samples from all of these locales discussed today that GIA uses to identify country of origin?
I believe GIA has visited all the locations that I mentioned today. I think the only one that is probably a little rarer is going to be the Sri Lankan rubies. Because Sri Lanka has never been really known as a ruby deposit, although it produced some rubies. So that might be the only deposit where we have maybe a little less. But we do have some borderline rubies from Sri Lanka. So yeah, GIA has all of those stones in their reference collection, in their research collection, that are being used to get the reference data that we're using for country of origin determination on rubies.
Okay, great. Trying to pick through the questions just to make sure that we don't go too long. Is there any geological reason for a gem that it takes so long to find? So, you know, as we're discovering new sources, is there any geological reason that takes us so long to discover a certain source? Well,
first of all, the mineral corundum is a fairly rare mineral. If you're looking for amethyst, quartz is one of the most abundant materials on Earth. Corundum is not. You need very specific pressures, temperatures, but also and especially chemical conditions to grow corundum. And then you only have corundum. Then you need to get corundum that is colored by chromium. Chromium is not a common element. To combine that corundum and chromium, you really have to be in the sweet spot. Plus, on top of that, you need to be able to grow fine crystals, which means that you need to really be in basically everything has to come together to form rubies. And I think that is why they are so extremely rare. And this applies for a lot of gemstones, actually. Same applies for emeralds, for alexandrites, for tsavorite, for demantoids, that you really need all those perfect conditions for crystal growth, for chemical growth, for the right coloration, for all of them to get together.
Okay. Last one, what are the main differences between Burmese and Thailand rubies as far as color and inclusions?
Well, the inclusion scenes are completely different. I think if there's a lot of articles published, as I've shown, over the last 80 years. There's an article by Dr. Gubelin from 1940 in G&G that just is titled Differences Between Siam and Burma Rubies. So that will also already answer all your questions. But yeah, I think color-wise, Thai rubies tend to be a little bit darker. They're not as fluorescent as the Burmese rubies. So Burmese rubies usually have a brighter appearance. But Thai rubies are usually a bit cleaner. But it's mainly that color tone where Thai rubies are a bit darker and less fluorescent that an experienced eye can make a really good educated guess based on the color there.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And thanks again for doing it at midnight your time. And
no worries,
thank you,
happy to do it.
Good, good. Thank you to everyone who's joining us today. And if you have any other questions, please follow us on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter, and we can get back to you there as well. And thanks for coming, and join us again next week, where we'll be joined by Wu Yi Wang to give us an update on lab-grown diamonds from China. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Have a great day, everyone.